Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not loud with battles or victories, but soft with the small rituals that came before an ending. Here history does not march with trumpets. It drifts in hushed tones, heavy with secrets that lived behind closed doors. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that these forgotten mysteries can drift a little farther, maybe even reaching others in your family who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see those tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. And now, let us step into the first part of our story. When night deepens and the world slows to a whisper, history often speaks in voices too faint to be heard during the clamour of the day. If one listens carefully, there are stories that rise not from triumphs, nor from the beauty of great cities, but from the shadows where trade and silence entwined. Among these forgotten corridors lies one of the strangest and darkest marketplaces humanity ever created, the sale of innocence itself. It begins not with kings or empires, but with something more fragile: belief. For centuries, across civilizations, purity was not only a virtue, but a commodity, a treasure guarded, negotiated, and exchanged. Virginity became more than the quiet fact of the body. It was turned into a seal of honour, a symbol of untouched value. The idea took root slowly, binding itself to ritual, to inheritance, and to fear. And once belief settled into the hearts of men and women alike, the marketplace opened its gates. Imagine the earliest settlements, where huts of reed and mud pressed close together and the smoke of cooking fires curled above the roofs. Survival left little room for luxury, yet even here, among scarcity, the first whispers of transaction began. Virginity was not yet named as such, but purity, youth untouched, was seen as a form of power. For a family, it was a bargaining chip. For a father, it was an unspent coin. For a community, it was a standard to uphold. What could not be weighed on scales was nonetheless carried into every marriage negotiation, every whispered contract. As civilizations grew, so too did the weight of this fragile currency. In Mesopotamia, where the rivers gave life to the first cities, laws carved in stone revealed the boundaries of trade and crime. Among them were rules that measured a woman's worth through her chastity, her untouched state before marriage. Here, purity and property became entwined. The notion of a bride's virginity was not merely symbolic, it was legally binding, a foundation for alliances between families. The moment purity was defined, it became something that could be bargained, sold, and stripped away in the open view of society. The marketplace was rarely a literal one at first. It existed in conversations at doorways, in agreements sealed with nods, in the coins slipped from one hand to another. A girl's first night was bought long before her wedding day, wrapped inside dowries and arranged futures. Fathers weighed offers with the patience of merchants, considering cattle, land, or gold, not merely for their own prosperity, but for the social survival of their kin. Virginity became the most invisible of currencies, silent, yet constantly exchanged. Yet silence rarely lasts. What began as hidden negotiation soon became spectacle. In some lands, the exchange was elevated to ritual, drawn out before temples and communities. The purity of a daughter was linked not only to her family's honour, but to the gods themselves. To surrender her untouched state was to enact a sacred transaction, one that blurred the line between worship and commerce. Innocence became both an offering and a product. The marketplace of innocence carried its weight most heavily on the daughters themselves. For them, purity was not a choice, but a burden. Their bodies became vessels of family pride. Their untouched state, the only ticket to survival in a world where alliances and inheritance mattered more than affection. Behind closed doors, mothers whispered warnings, teaching their daughters to guard what was not entirely theirs. For girls, virginity was never simply about the self. It was about survival, debt, and the slow grind of expectation. The cruelty of the system was not only that purity could be sold, but that it was demanded. A daughter's first night was not her own. In some places, strangers might place bids, gold exchanged for the chance to claim what society called untouched. In others, rulers and priests set the price, declaring the act to be sacred or necessary. At its core, however, it was always the same. Innocence became something that could be taken, for a price agreed upon by others. There is something chilling in imagining the scenes. A father sitting at a low wooden table, haggling not over wheat or sheep, but over his daughter's worth. Coins stacked neatly before him. A suitor across the room, nodding solemnly, as if he were purchasing land. The girl, silent, eyes lowered, taught from birth that this was her duty. Around them, life went on. The market outside filled with fruit sellers and potters, children playing in the dust. But within those walls, another market thrived, darker and quieter than any stall in the open air. This marketplace was not confined to one corner of the world. Across distant cultures, from Mesopotamia to Greece, from Babylon to the valleys of India, virginity carried a price. In some regions, temples became the brokers, declaring that a woman must give her first night to a stranger as an offering to the gods. The stranger paid, the temple profited, and the girl was told it was holy. Elsewhere, noble families disguised the same transaction as dowries, payments that masked the purchase with the veil of respectability. No matter how it was framed, the pattern remained. Innocence had a value, and that value could be bought. Over centuries, the market only deepened. Stories of auctions and bidding echo faintly through time. Whispers of young women lined up not for labour, but for their untouched state. Men with coin purses heavy from trade decided, with glances and nods, who would claim the right. For those who paid, it was a purchase of desire mixed with prestige. To buy virginity was to buy what others had not yet touched, to possess what was still considered sacred. For those who sold, it was a means of survival. Hunger was quieted with coin. Debt was erased. Families endured another season. Yet survival carried its shadow. The girls sold into this marketplace bore scars that could not be tallied in ledgers. Their innocence, transformed into currency, left them with little choice but resignation. They were told it was tradition, that it was holy, that it was necessary for their families. They bore the weight in silence, their voices drowned in the rustle of coins and the murmurs of men. The marketplace of innocence was never an open bazaar with banners and cries, but it was no less real. It existed in chambers, in rituals, in whispered negotiations. It was written in laws, in customs, in the expectations of entire civilizations. Virginity became a shadow coin, one of the most enduring currencies in human history, passed from hand to hand without ever appearing on a table. The story of this marketplace is not one of sudden invention, but of slow accumulation. Each generation taught the next that purity was a treasure. Each culture found ways to measure and protect it, and each society devised methods to exchange it. Over time, the private became public, and the intimate became transactional. The innocence of daughters became wealth for fathers, a prize for buyers, and a burden for the girls themselves. As the centuries turned, the practice spread across empires and faiths, shifting in shape but never disappearing. What began in whispers became laws. What began as silent trade became ritual. What began as survival became spectacle. And always, behind it, there was a girl whose life was altered, whose body became the stage for a transaction older than most kingdoms. The marketplace of innocence did not rise from cruelty alone, but from a world where survival was fragile, and families clung to any advantage. Yet its darkness remains, for it transformed the most personal of human experiences into a commodity. To imagine its beginnings is to step into a history that rarely makes its way into textbooks, but lingers in the silence of old laws, in the rituals recorded on clay, in the faint traces of lives once sold. Even now, in the quiet of night, when the noise of the day has fallen away, the echoes of that marketplace remain. They tell of fathers who counted coins, of priests who declared it sacred, of men who bought what should never have been sold, and of girls whose innocence became the most fragile currency of all. And so the story begins, not with a single place or time, but with the opening of a marketplace unlike any other, a marketplace of innocence, where the first currency was not gold, but purity, measured, weighed, and sold in the shadows of history. As the marketplace of innocence took root, it was not merely coin or cattle that sustained it, but something older and heavier: belief. Without belief, virginity would have remained a private matter, little more than a moment in the life of a young woman. But societies across the ancient world carried it beyond the body, binding it to gods, to destiny, and to the very order of existence. It was this weight of purity, layered with fear and reverence, that turned the act of first intimacy into a sacred hinge on which families, fortunes, and faiths seemed to turn. In the earliest civilizations, purity was not framed in the language of contracts alone, but in the whispers of the divine. The untouched body was thought to hold power, not simply because it was unspoiled, but because it was closer to the realm of the gods. To be a virgin was to stand at a threshold, suspended between childhood and womanhood, unclaimed by any man, and therefore marked by a kind of sacred neutrality. Many cultures feared this liminal state as much as they revered it. It was a condition too pure to last, a vessel waiting to be claimed, and because of that, it was seen as dangerous, potent, and worthy of ritual. Belief hardened into expectation. In Mesopotamia, purity was tied to law, but also to the unseen. The gods, it was said, favoured the untouched as offerings. Women entering temples to serve as priestesses often had their virginity inspected, as though their flesh itself could prove their worthiness. Purity was not theirs to guard, but theirs to surrender in the manner prescribed by tradition. At times it was given to gods through ritual acts that disguised commerce as holiness. At others, it was given to men who paid under the watch of the temple, convinced they were participating in something divine. In each case, the belief sanctified the trade. Across the Nile, in Egypt, the weight of purity wore a different shape. Here, women enjoyed more freedoms than in many other lands, yet virginity still carried symbolic force. In the tales whispered along the banks of the river, goddesses were often portrayed as chaste maidens before union with the gods. To be pure was to echo the myth of creation, the untouched waters before they were stirred. The first embrace of a woman was not seen as hers alone, but as an echo of the gods shaping the cosmos. It was not only her family who laid claim to it, but the order of the world itself. In Greece, belief wrapped virginity in paradox. The goddess Artemis, forever untouched, was a symbol of strength and freedom, her purity granting her independence from men. Yet mortal women were given no such liberty. For them, virginity was a temporary possession, its loss controlled by fathers, negotiated by families, sanctified or sold through ceremony. The untouched maiden carried the weight of family honour, while the untouched goddess carried the weight of divinity. In both cases, purity was imagined as more than flesh. It was a symbol, a vessel, a thing to be guarded with severity. The Romans, inheritors of Greek thought, took the weight of purity and embedded it into ritual power. The Vestal virgins, bound to 30 years of chastity, embodied the city's fate. Their untouched state was said to guard Rome itself. Their purity not theirs, but the empire's. Should one falter, should the vows be broken, the punishment was unthinkable. Burial alive, entombed with a small lamp and a crust of bread, as though purity once lost could only be hidden in the earth. Here, belief carved purity into the very stones of the city. The body of the Virgin was no longer her own. It was Rome's heartbeat, the silent currency of the god's favour. In the East, belief laid its burdens differently, but no less heavily. In India, texts from early centuries spoke of Kanyadan, the gift of a virgin daughter in marriage, as the highest duty of a father, the act that earned spiritual merit. Purity was not sold in markets openly, but was woven into the fabric of ritual. A father's salvation, it was said, depended upon the unbroken virginity of his daughter at the moment of marriage. Here, belief transformed the girl into a bridge between her father and the divine, her untouched state, an offering not only to a husband, but to the gods themselves. The weight was immense, for she carried not only her own fate, but her family's eternal one. What ties these cultures together is not uniformity, but obsession. Each framed purity differently, yet all agreed it was too valuable to belong to the girl herself. Whether as temple offering, divine echo, legal bond, or familial salvation, virginity was placed beyond the realm of personal choice. It became the intersection where human desire, divine will, and economic survival met. And so the weight of purity pressed down, unseen but constant, shaping the lives of those who carried it. To carry purity was to walk with invisible chains. A girl might play in the streets, laugh with friends, and dream as any child does, yet around her stretched the tight cords of expectation. Every gesture, every glance, every step outside her home was shadowed by the question of her untouched state. Mothers reminded their daughters that their worth depended upon it. Fathers weighed its value in coins and alliances. Priests reminded entire communities that the gods demanded it. Even neighbours and strangers became watchers, their eyes sharp for any rumour that could stain the fragile fabric of a girl's reputation. Belief made purity a public matter, though it remained locked inside the private body. The cruelty of such weight was not always obvious to those who upheld it. Many believed sincerely that purity protected order, that virginity preserved balance between the human and the divine. A girl's sacrifice, whether through arranged marriage, temple rite, or ritual sale, was framed as noble, necessary, even sacred. Yet beneath these layers of sanctity lay the same reality. A body exchanged, a life redirected, an innocence turned into currency. Belief gave the practice its justification, but commerce ensured its endurance. In some corners of the ancient world, purity was thought to hold magical power. The blood of a virgin, whispered healers, could cure disease. The touch of an untouched girl could ward off misfortune. Sailors prayed for virgins aboard their ships to calm the seas, while soldiers believed purity could sway the outcome of wars. Myths spun around the figure of the untouched maiden, granting her powers she never asked for. Yet these beliefs only deepened the burden, for the girl was no longer simply herself. She was a talisman, a vessel of imagined strength, and therefore a prize for those who sought power. Belief carved deep scars into laws as well. In many places, a marriage without virginity could be annulled. A husband could reject a bride if her purity was not proven. Blood-stained sheets became evidence of value, a grim ritual carried out in countless homes, where the most intimate act of a young woman's life was transformed into proof of transaction. If the proof was absent, her worth crumbled. The law, the family, and the gods were thought to have been deceived. Punishments ranged from public shame to death, for the loss of purity without sanctioned exchange was considered theft from the very structures of society. And so belief, intangible and invisible, became one of history's most enduring weights. It pressed down upon households, upon daughters, upon lovers who wished for affection, but found themselves bound by ritual. It shaped marriages, alliances, and entire empires. The untouched body was turned into a hinge upon which civilizations claim to rest. When one steps back, the weight appears almost unbearable, and yet it endured for millennia. Not because it was universally true, but because it was universally believed. Belief transformed virginity into more than flesh. It made it myth, law, economy, and ritual all at once. And once it was myth, it could not easily be unmade. As nights passed in the ancient cities, fires burned low, and families slept on mats of straw or carved beds of stone. Yet even in slumber, the weight remained. Fathers dreamed of alliances, mothers fretted over their daughters' guarded innocence, priests rehearsed their rituals, and daughters themselves lay quietly, knowing that their first breath into womanhood was not their own. The weight of purity was not carried by the girls alone. It was carried by entire societies, which built their stability on it, their myths around it, their laws within it. But the burden fell most heavily upon the innocent themselves, who bore it silently, their voices drowned beneath the chorus of tradition and belief. It is within this atmosphere of reverence and fear, sanctity and commerce, that the marketplace of innocence grew stronger. For belief was the scaffolding, and upon it the darkest exchanges would continue to climb. Belief gave weight to purity, but belief alone could not sustain the trade. In every city where life pressed against scarcity, where debts grew faster than harvests, and fortunes rose or collapsed in a single season, innocence became something more than sacred. It became negotiable. When fathers and families found themselves staring into the hollow of hunger or the shame of unpaid loans, virginity was transformed from silent burden into bargaining tool. The transaction was rarely gentle. It was written in the ink of desperation, sealed with coins that glittered in the lamplight, and often shadowed by blood. Markets have always thrived on imbalance. One side holds need, the other holds desire. The same was true in the commerce of purity. Families brought their daughters' untouched state, not as a gift, but as a last resource, while men with wealth approached it as conquest or investment. The bargain was struck somewhere between hunger and hunger of another kind. Those who sold hoped to buy survival. Those who purchased sought something more primal, the claim to be first, to hold what no one else had yet touched. The exchange itself, hidden behind closed doors, was simple, but its echoes were anything but. In Babylon, the practice took on a ritual form that blurred the line between religion and sale. Historians wrote of maidens assembled in the public square, their futures auctioned beneath the gaze of entire communities. The most beautiful drew the highest bids, their families enriched with gold, the less desired were taken for smaller sums, or even given away, their purity less a treasure than a burden lifted. These auctions were framed as marriages, but the truth was plainer. Innocence was being weighed and purchased as openly as grain or cattle. For the girl, there was little difference whether the bargain was cloaked in temple blessing or shouted across a crowd. Her fate was sealed in the clink of coins. Not every bargain was public. In private homes, fathers measured the worth of their daughters with grim arithmetic. A man in debt might save his land by arranging the first night of his child with a creditor. A merchant might strengthen his network by offering his daughter's untouched state as part of a partnership. These were not whispered scandals. They were accepted practices, rituals of survival that carried the same cold logic as any other trade. The only difference was that the commodity bled. Blood itself became part of the bargain. In many lands, proof of virginity was demanded. The first night transformed into a performance of evidence. A sheet, stained and displayed, was more than intimacy. It was a receipt. Without it, a bride might be returned like flawed merchandise, her family disgraced, her body marked as worthless. In these grim transactions, the body was not only the site of trade but the ledger, the proof that the bargain had been honoured. If the evidence was absent, the consequences could spill into violence. Women accused of failing to provide proof were cast out, beaten, or even executed, their lives undone by the lack of blood on cloth. Gold, too, told its story. In Rome, dowries were vast and carefully calculated, their size linked not only to wealth, but to the bride's perceived purity. A virgin carried a dowry that could elevate her family. A widow or divorced woman carried less. Virginity inflated value, and thus men with means competed for it, offering sums that would secure both flesh and fortune. To buy a virgin was to purchase prestige, the promise of untainted lineage, and a guarantee that no rival had come before. The transaction was couched in the language of law, but at its heart lay the same hunger, possession of the untouched. In some places, the bargain was less about wealth than about bloodlines. Among nobles and rulers, purity became the seal of legitimacy. A queen or princess untainted before marriage was proof that heirs were undisputed, that dynasties rested on unquestioned beginnings. Here the bargain was not between hunger and wealth, but between power and power. Virginity was bartered for alliances that bound kingdoms together, each coin of innocence securing treaties, armies, and lands. Yet the girl at the centre of it remained silent, her role reduced to the body that guaranteed the ink of diplomacy would not run. For the daughters themselves, these bargains felt like invisible chains tightening around their lives. From childhood, they were raised to understand that their worth was measured in anticipation of this single exchange. They learned to walk with lowered eyes, to guard themselves from rumour, to endure the watchful scrutiny of neighbours and kin. When the day of bargain arrived, there was no choice to be made. The contract was already written, her body already promised. What was framed as consent was nothing more than silence taught since birth. Stories linger of girls who resisted, who fled from homes or temples rather than be sold. Their names rarely survived, but their punishments did. Hunted, captured, returned in disgrace. To run from the bargain was to run from one's family, one's community, even one's gods. Few dared it, and fewer succeeded. The marketplace was not a place one could step out of. It was the ground upon which entire societies had built their foundations. The darker shadows of this commerce stretched beyond marriage. Brothels across empires kept rooms set aside for men who would pay fortunes to be the first with a virgin. Some were true maidens, sold by families who could no longer feed them. Others were girls whose innocence was fabricated, their worth inflated by deceit. Yet whether real or imagined, the price of untouched flesh was always higher, always sought, always clutched with greed. The bargain of blood and gold flourished in these spaces, far from ritual, far from law, yet born of the same obsession that made families sell their daughters in daylight. If belief gave purity its mythic weight, blood and gold ensured its endurance. They made the trade tangible, measurable, binding. Every coin exchange was another nail in the coffin of choice. Every sheet inspected was another reminder that innocence was not personal, but public property. What might have been a fleeting moment in a young woman's life became instead a lifelong marker, branded into her identity by the bargain struck in her name. There is a cruelty in imagining the scene. A father, his hands trembling as he counts the coins that will save his farm, while his daughter sits nearby, silent, her future decided with each clink of metal. A creditor leaning back in satisfaction, knowing his loan is repaid not in silver, but in flesh. A crowd roaring as a beautiful girl is sold to the highest bidder, her tears ignored, her body appraised like cattle. These were not rare exceptions. They were the mechanics of survival, the machinery of societies that made purity both sacred and sellable. The blood that stained the sheets, the coins that filled purses, the lives redirected by bargains. They were not accidents of history, but the very structure upon which communities leaned. Families endured famine through these trades. Kingdoms secured power. Temples enriched themselves. Men fed their pride. And always, in the shadows of these gains, a girl lost something she had never been allowed to claim as her own. It is here, in the exchange of blood and gold, that the marketplace of innocence revealed its darkest face. No longer hidden in belief alone, it stood bare in the clang of coins, in the cries of brides, in the laws that demanded proof. Innocence was no longer simply sacred, it was priced. And once priced, it could be bought by anyone with enough to spend. The bargains left marks not only on the lives of those sold, but on the memory of civilizations themselves. In their myths, their laws, their rituals, the same shadow appears. Innocence reduced to contract, sanctity to commodity, love to ledger. Each bargain, written in blood and gold, tightened the cords of a trade that would outlast empires and stretch its fingers into every corner of the human story. In the dim corners of history, where the ledger of human value was scrawled in trembling hands, fathers often found themselves caught in a cruel arithmetic. The balance sheet of honour, wealth, and survival was not written in numbers alone, but in the bodies and fates of their daughters. A girl was not simply a child. She was a fragile vessel of family reputation, a commodity whose price rose or fell with the weight of her untouched purity. The calculations were quiet, sometimes unspoken, yet they governed the pulse of households from Rome to the distant reaches of Asia, from the narrow streets of medieval towns to the dusty courtyards of tribal villages. A father might never admit to it aloud, but his daughter's body was a coin, minted not in metal, but in the shimmering illusion of honour. Honour, after all, was rarely an individual possession. It clung like a garment to entire families, inherited and defended, easily soiled by whispers. A daughter's virginity was not hers alone. It was the family's shield, the final bastion of decency in a world eager to expose weakness. And so fathers held it with an almost feverish desperation, both protecting it and preparing to spend it when the moment demanded. A transaction dressed as marriage, a negotiation wrapped in custom. Yet beneath every veil, beneath every ceremonial vow, lurked the same unyielding truth. Her body was the family's bargaining chip. The language of honour was often cloaked in poetry, as if words could soften the brutality of the trade. In Roman law, the paterfamilias carried the weight of absolute authority. His daughter's virtue was not hers to guard, but his to wield, a treasure that could elevate the family's standing when offered wisely, or drag them into disgrace when squandered. Marriage contracts were less about affection than about alliances, a web of obligations binding households together. A daughter entered the negotiation table as silently as livestock. The men spoke for her, and the ink of the contract was heavier than her consent. She might be adorned with wreaths and jewels, but beneath it all, she was a vessel, sealed, inspected, and handed over. This pattern was not Rome's invention. Across ancient societies, purity was entwined with property, and property was entwined with survival. In the bustling marketplaces of Mesopotamia, dowries moved like tides, flowing from father to husband, ensuring that the daughter's body was never freely hers. Among the Greeks, too, a bride's virginity was a currency. Her father's reputation cast into her. Her untouched state, the only guarantee that the lineage would remain unsullied. For men, honour was measured by deeds in battle or the sway of their words in public. For women, it was measured by the silence of what had not yet been done to them. And yet, the cruel irony lingered. Fathers who claimed to guard their daughter's purity were also the ones who sold it, dressed in ritual, cloaked in custom, hidden behind the language of duty. A dowry was never just a gift. It was a price tag, a calculated weight attached to her body. The richer the family, the heavier the dowry, the greater the expectation that her untouched state was worth every coin. Poor fathers, meanwhile, found themselves trapped in a harsher equation. When survival demanded bread, sometimes the only offering left was the unbroken promise of a daughter's virginity. Poverty stripped away ceremony, leaving the raw trade exposed. In medieval Europe, the matter grew even more tangled. A daughter's chastity became not only a family's honour, but a reflection of divine order. The Church preached that purity was sacred, yet in practice, purity became negotiable, bartered in courtships, sold in marriages, even violated in the name of spiritual vows. Fathers invoked God as a witness when they handed over their daughters, as though holiness itself sanctioned the marketplace. It was easier, perhaps, to believe that these transactions were ordained by heaven than to confront the unsettling truth. A girl's body was being traded like a relic, valued not for her soul, but for the state of her flesh. Stories trickled through time, small tragedies hidden behind grand chronicles. In the dusty records of towns, one finds contracts that read like inventories. Land exchanged, coin delivered, and in return the daughter herself, her honour guaranteed, her purity attested. Fathers sign these agreements with a trembling hand, not always from reluctance, but from the knowledge that their daughters carried the fragile weight of an entire lineage. A single rumour could fracture generations of standing. A single betrayal could sink a family into disgrace. And so, the burden fell on the girls, though they were rarely asked if they wished to carry it. The paradox was endless. Fathers spoke of love and protection, yet their hands delivered daughters to strangers. They justified their actions with the language of care. It was for her future, for the family's name, for the preservation of honour. But beneath each justification was fear. Fear that poverty would expose them. Fear that dishonour would destroy them. Fear that the invisible marketplace of virtue would render them worthless if they failed to secure the best bargain. In some cultures, the obsession grew darker still. Purity was not merely a token of honour, but a literal commodity, exchanged like property. Fathers could arrange for their daughters to be given to the highest bidder, their futures transformed into coin, livestock, or land. In desperate corners of the world, where famine gnawed and war stripped families bare, a daughter's reputation became a lifeline. One could see the cruelty of the trade most clearly in its extremes, where the rhetoric of honour was stripped away, and only the transaction remained. Even among the wealthy, however, the cruelty endured in quieter forms. A noble father might secure alliances with a marriage contract that bound his daughter to a man twice her age, a man she had never spoken to, a man who saw her less as a partner than as a guarantee. The girl's own desires mattered as little as the ink on the page once it dried. Her father had spoken for her, had weighed her worth in the balance of politics, had traded her future in exchange for status. To him, this was duty fulfilled. To her, it was a lifetime sealed. Across centuries, the theatre repeated itself with minor variations. In Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, the figure of the father loomed as the broker of honour, the one who held the keys to a daughter's fate, not because she lacked worth, but because her worth was never hers to claim. Her life was the family's vault, and her purity its most precious coin. Fathers guarded it, polished it with vigilance, then chose the moment to spend it, sometimes lavishly, sometimes desperately, but almost never with her voice in the decision. And so, the story of fathers and daughters becomes not merely personal, but civilizational. It reveals how deeply societies have bound the idea of honour to female lives, and how easily love can be entangled with control. A father's hand resting on his daughter's shoulder may have seemed protective, but history tells us it was also a hand guiding her toward the marketplace, where silence and obedience were expected, and the price of defiance was ruin. What lingers in this history is not only the weight of the transactions themselves, but the haunting quiet with which they were carried out. In dim halls, in courtyards, in whispered conversations, decisions were made that shaped lives without their consent. Daughters walked into futures they had not chosen, their reputations already spoken for before they could speak for themselves. Fathers, carrying the burden of honour, convinced themselves that this was protection, when in truth it was a cage made of expectation, reputation, and fear. The story continues, of course, in the shadows of later centuries, where the language of honour persisted, dressed in new garments, but carrying the same old logic. The father remained a broker, the daughter a token, and virtue the coin upon which the edifice of reputation balanced. To see this history clearly is to understand how deeply the marketplace of purity has shaped human lives, not in grand wars or royal decrees, but in the quiet, everyday bargains written not only in contracts, but in the very silence of families. The sacred was never immune to the logic of trade. For as long as men have built shrines and raised stones toward heaven, the boundary between worship and commerce has been porous, shifting like sand under restless tides. The temple, with its columns and incense, its chants and carved idols, often stood as the most powerful marketplace of all, not only for offerings of grain or gold, but for something far more intimate. The body itself, wrapped in ritual, sanctified by prayer, became an offering placed at the altar. What was once sold in shadowed courtyards was here given the sheen of the divine. In the ancient city of Babylon, where ziggurats clawed at the sky and the Euphrates wound like a serpent through clay and brick, one finds the faint traces of a practice that blurred purity and devotion into one. Herodotus, peering through the veil of rumour and hearsay, spoke of women who were compelled to sit within the shadow of the great temple of Ishtar, waiting until a stranger cast a coin into their lap. Only then, and only with that coin, could they rise and give themselves. The act was not regarded as shameful, but sacred. The goddess herself was said to accept the offering through the body of the devotee. Yet behind the solemnity of ritual lay an economy. The coin was real, the transaction undeniable. What might be painted as piety was, in essence, the sanctified sale of flesh. Not all agreed on the details of this tale, yet the persistence of the story across centuries tells us something about the power of belief and the pliability of the human body when woven into it. Virginity, in this telling, was not a private possession, but a gift waiting to be unwrapped before the eyes of a deity. Fathers who had once guarded their daughters' honour might here bring them to the steps of the temple, where their untouched state was surrendered not to a husband or bidder, but to ritual. It was said to cleanse them, to mark them as favoured by the goddess. But whether the act was seen as sacrifice or transaction, the body at its centre remained the coin of exchange. This intertwining of religion and flesh did not belong to Babylon alone. In the sanctuaries of ancient Greece, whispers rose of women called hieroduloi, temple slaves who offered their bodies as extensions of the goddess's will. Corinth, with its towering temple to Aphrodite, was said to house 1,000 such women, each an instrument of devotion, each body folded into the commerce of piety. Sailors arriving at the port saw not only the city's marble and columns, but the waiting figures who stood beneath the goddess's gaze, ready to embody worship through surrender. The coin changed hands, but the explanation was loftier. It was service. It was offering. It was the body transformed into prayer. One might ask what these women thought as they lay beneath painted ceilings, the smoke of incense thick in the air, the sound of hymns echoing beyond the temple walls. Did they believe they were serving the goddess? Did they feel themselves trapped in another form of bargain, cloaked now in holiness, but no less binding? Their voices rarely reach us. What survives instead are the proclamations of priests and poets, men who justified the practice with the language of sanctity. To them, the temple's commerce was not degradation, but elevation. The body reimagined as an altar, its surrender a kind of worship. Yet even in this sanctity, fathers lingered in the background. To dedicate a daughter to the temple was sometimes to remove the burden of her care, to lift the weight of her purity from the fragile shield of family honour and place it instead upon the shoulders of the gods. A father could step back, his role fulfilled, his daughter's virginity no longer his to guard or spend. The temple absorbed her, and with her, the responsibilities and dangers she carried. For the family, this was not always shame. It could be pride, a declaration that their bloodline was close to the divine. But in practical terms, it was another form of transaction. The body moved from one marketplace to another, from the household to the sanctuary. In India, echoes of this logic appeared in the Devadasi tradition, where young girls were dedicated to deities, bound to temples not by vows of chastity, but by the expectation of service. Some became dancers, their movements a living hymn, their gestures carrying the weight of centuries-old symbolism. But beneath the dance lingered the shadow of the flesh trade. Patrons who funded temples and festivals often claimed the right to their bodies, and the sacred merged with the transactional. A girl given to a god became in practice the possession of men who cloaked their desire in the language of worship. The paradox is difficult to ignore. Virginity, celebrated as pure, was often surrendered in spaces meant to embody purity itself. Temples, the supposed sanctuaries of the soul, became theatres where the drama of commerce unfolded upon the stage of the body. Gold clinked against stone, priests chanted, and somewhere behind the solemnity lay the faint, undeniable sound of a bargain. This does not mean every ritual was cynical, nor that every devotee felt trapped. For some, there may have been genuine belief, a sense that the goddess spoke through their surrender, that their bodies were sanctified by the role they played. Faith can mask exploitation, or perhaps transform it into something else in the minds of those who endure it. But history leaves us with more questions than answers. Did these women truly feel blessed? Or were they taught to see blessing where only necessity lay? Was the temple a place of liberation from family constraints, or merely a new set of chains, heavier because they were gilded with divinity? The trade of the sacred body spread beyond temples too, seeping into the fabric of festivals, rites, and pilgrimages. In some places, girls were expected to prove devotion by surrendering their virginity at shrines, their first experience of the flesh framed as an offering to gods. In others, wealthy patrons sought out temple women precisely because they carried the aura of sanctity. To lie with them was to lie with the goddess herself, to draw closer to divinity through the trembling of flesh. Such beliefs only deepened the marketplace, for now the body was not merely a commodity, but a vessel of divine proximity, worth more than coin, worth perhaps even salvation. Still, one cannot escape the image of young women seated at temple gates, waiting for strangers, their bodies pledged not by their own voices, but by fathers, priests, or tradition. The sacred glow did little to soften the starkness of the reality. The transaction endured, as relentless as the smoke rising from sacrificial fires. Over time, the practices shifted, some fading into legend, others persisting in altered forms. The rise of stricter moral codes in certain religions condemned such rites as profane, yet even condemnation acknowledged their power. To erase them required effort, sermons, and edicts. And still, traces lingered. The idea that virginity could be surrendered in the name of the divine did not vanish easily, for it had already carved deep grooves into the human imagination. When we look back upon these temples, we see not only columns and carvings, not only incense and chanting, but the quiet shadows of countless women whose bodies bore the weight of both commerce and worship. Their names are lost, their voices silenced, yet their role in this economy of sanctity remains etched into the foundations of history. The temple, meant to be a house of gods, became a marketplace of flesh, its stones absorbing the murmurs of bargains that were never written, but lived. What lingers is not simply outrage or pity, but the quiet recognition of how human societies have blurred lines between sacred and profane, how fathers, priests and rulers alike found ways to transform the most intimate of possessions into currency. The body, once seen as the vessel of purity, became the vessel of exchange, dressed now in divine robes, but still traded, still priced, still surrendered. And so, beneath the echo of hymns, beneath the flicker of oil lamps against temple walls, history whispers its uneasy truth. Even the holiest places were not free from the marketplace, and even the most sacred bodies could be bought, if one only knew the price. In the heart of Mesopotamia, where rivers split the soil into fertile veins, and cities rose like mirages of baked brick, Babylon stood as a crown. Its walls, broad enough for chariots to race upon, cast long shadows over markets, thick with the scent of spices, the cries of merchants, and the shimmer of hammered bronze. Yet not all exchanges were measured in jars of oil or measures of grain. Some were quieter, more intimate, unfolding behind closed doors or beneath the silent gaze of towering temples. It was here that the idea of a first night, priced and purchased, grew into one of history's most unsettling legacies. The story that drifts to us from Babylon is wrapped in both reverence and unease. Ancient writers spoke of a custom where women, untouched, were compelled to sit within the precinct of Ishtar's great temple, awaiting the moment a stranger cast a coin into their lap. The ritual, described in voices half in awe and half in disdain, was framed not as shame but as duty, a necessary act of devotion. The first surrender of the body, the first breaking of innocence, was not to be claimed by a husband, nor guarded in secrecy by a family. It was to be given away under the gaze of the goddess, sanctified by coin, and witnessed by the great city itself. Herodotus, chronicler of distant lands, painted this custom in strokes both vivid and cold. He claimed that every woman, once in her life, must take her place in the temple and await the stranger who would pay for her virginity. The price was not hers to name. The man's offering, however small, was to be accepted, for it was not the woman's choice, but the goddess's will. The act itself, however fleeting, was marked as sacred. Yet beneath the cloak of sanctity, the mechanics of commerce were unmistakable. A coin slid from hand to lap. The virginity was gone, and the first night was spent not in the tenderness of a chosen bond, but in the inevitability of transaction. It is uncertain how widely or strictly such a practice was observed. Historians debate whether Herodotus exaggerated, whether his tale was coloured by hearsay or cultural disdain. Still, the persistence of the story speaks volumes. Babylon was, in the imagination of the ancient world, the city where purity itself had a price. To outsiders, it embodied the paradox of a society where temples rang with hymns, while within their shadow, the most intimate of acts became a public duty. Imagine the young women of Babylon, led by fathers or mothers to the temple gates, clothed in simple garments, seated on cold stone steps, while strangers' eyes wandered over them. Some waited for hours, others for days, until at last a coin dropped into their lap. The clink of bronze or silver was the sound of fate arriving. The first night was no longer a private passage, but a toll collected in the name of the goddess. For some, perhaps, the act carried the numb dignity of ritual. For others, it must have felt like abandonment. Their purity surrendered not for love or family honour, but for the price set by a stranger's whim. This practice cannot be separated from the larger machinery of Babylonian society, where women's roles were tightly bound to law, property, and inheritance. Hammurabi's code, etched in black stone, spoke often of purity, marriage, and the rights of men over women's bodies. Virginity was not a private treasure. It was an asset, a legal marker of value. A daughter's untouched state could seal alliances, determine dowries, or, as in the Temple of Ishtar, be converted into the goddess's currency. To surrender it was to transform potential dishonour into holy compliance, a transaction framed as devotion rather than degradation. The priests, keepers of ritual, no doubt justified the practice in lofty words. They would have said that Ishtar, goddess of love and war, demanded such offerings, that the surrender of a first night honoured her domain over both desire and destruction. Yet their voices also served the practical needs of the temple. Coin flowed steadily into its coffers, and with coin came power. The first nights of countless women became tributaries feeding into the wealth of Babylon's sacred heart. For the men who participated, the ritual carried a strange double meaning. To them, it was both pleasure and piety. To lie with a virgin under the goddess's gaze was to touch not only flesh, but divinity. To join desire with duty, coin was enough to sanctify the act. The buyer could walk away cleansed, his coin transformed into sacrifice, his lust transfigured into worship. The woman, meanwhile, walked away changed forever, her purity gone, her body now fit for marriage, her duty to the goddess fulfilled. The image of this practice travelled far, seeping into the imagination of neighbouring peoples. To some, it confirmed the decadence of Babylon. That city so rich and restless, it dared to place even virginity on the scales of commerce. To others, it was proof of the city's greatness, its refusal to hide the raw truth of desire behind the pretense of modesty. Either way, the tale endured, carried across borders, whispered by travellers who gazed at the ziggurats and carried home stories of the women who waited in their shadow. The price of a first night in Babylon was not always measured in coins alone. For some women, it was the price of waiting, days spent in limbo, watching others chosen before them, enduring the slow erosion of dignity as strangers passed them by. For others, the price was the memory of a first night emptied of tenderness, replaced instead by the cold mechanics of duty. For fathers, it was the relinquishing of their daughter's purity to a ritual that spared them the burden of protecting it. And for the city, it was the quiet assurance that no woman stood apart from the goddess, that every womb was first touched by the logic of commerce before it became the vessel of lineage. Though centuries have passed, and the walls of Babylon have crumbled into dust, the echo of this practice lingers. It speaks to the way societies transform purity into property, innocence into currency. The story may be wrapped in ritual, may be softened by the language of faith, but at its heart remains a marketplace. The first night, stripped of intimacy, became a public toll, a payment made not in secrecy, but under the gaze of God and man alike. What survives is not only the story of women waiting on temple steps, but the larger truth it reveals, that even in the most dazzling of cities, where gods were said to walk among men, the body could be bought, and virginity could be sold, not by the woman herself, but by the structures of power that surrounded her. Babylon may have wrapped this trade in incense and hymns, but the clink of coin told its own story, one that cannot be mistaken. The city that raised its towers to the heavens also dug deep into the soil of human intimacy, planting seeds of a commerce so dark that even now it unsettles. The price of a first night in Babylon was not merely a coin, it was the transformation of purity into property, of worship into transaction. It was the city's reminder that nothing, not even the most fragile of human thresholds, was beyond the reach of the marketplace. Where Babylon wrapped the first night in incense and ritual, Rome stripped it bare, setting it beneath the hammer of the auctioneer. The eternal city, with its marble forums and avenues choked with the clatter of sandals, was not only a place of politics and empire, but of markets that measured every human thing in silver and bronze. Rome did not pretend that trade of the body was sanctified. It proclaimed it openly, catalogued it, taxed it, and made it spectacle. In the shadow of its temples, within the noise of its bustling forums, virginity was bought not as a sacred offering, but as a commodity, announced, displayed, and sold to the highest bidder. The auction block was no stranger to Roman life. Slaves, captured in war or born into servitude, were paraded in chains, their qualities called out to the crowd by men with practiced voices. Strong backs, clear eyes, skilled hands, all were priced and sold. Yet within this economy of flesh lay another layer, one more hushed but no less pervasive. The untouched body, the girl whose innocence had not yet been broken, was advertised not for her strength or her skill, but for her purity. She was marked as special stock, her value heightened by the promise of first possession. The Roman world spoke bluntly of such things. Virginity was treated as rarity, a finite resource that, once spent, could never be replenished. A virgin slave fetched higher prices than her experienced counterpart, not because her labour differed, but because her body offered something men believed could be claimed only once. Buyers, whether seeking pleasure or prestige paid dearly for this illusion of untouched flesh. Auctioneers understood the allure, and so they paraded virgins carefully, cloaking them in suggestion, stripping them with words, until the crowd's hunger set the bidding aflame. In households where fathers struggled under debt, daughters sometimes became unwilling participants in this trade. Roman law gave the paterfamilias, the father, the power of life and death over his children, and with it, the authority to sell them. For a man pressed by creditors, the untouched state of a daughter was a form of hidden wealth, one vile reserve to be converted into coin. To offer her virginity at auction was to turn desperation into temporary relief, though the cost was borne by her body, her silence, her lost first night. Even beyond the slave markets, the same logic bled into the marriages of Rome's elite. Among the noble houses, virginity was less a commodity to be purchased by strangers than a currency exchange between families. Alliances were forged through carefully arranged unions, and the virginity of a daughter became the dowry's invisible weight. Fathers spoke of it as an asset, not in whispers but in ledgers. A girl untouched brought honour to the family, her body unspoiled, her womb prepared to carry the bloodline of another house. Though this trade was dressed in ceremony and law, it remained a transaction, its language different, but its foundation the same as the auctioneer's call. The poets of Rome, those who clothed their verses in honeyed words, were not blind to this economy. Juvenal, sharp-tongued satirist wrote of women whose virginity was bartered away, mocking the hypocrisy of a society that clothed desire in the pretense of dignity. Martial, with his biting wit, hinted at the quiet bargains struck behind closed doors, where a maiden's first night was less a gift of love than a negotiation of coin and favour. Their verses, though meant to sting, reveal the commonplace acceptance of such trades in Roman thought. Yet in the brothels of the city, the darkest expression of this marketplace was found. Prostitution in Rome was legal, taxed, and regulated, and within its shadowed chambers the lure of the virgin commanded the highest prices. Brothel keepers boasted of untouched girls, advertising them with chalk signs scrawled on walls or whispered promises to wealthy patrons. Men paid dearly for the privilege of being first, believing that possession of innocence was a mark of status, a thrill unmatched. In reality, the brothel's promise was often illusion, a fiction spun for profit, yet the hunger for it persisted, feeding an endless cycle of demand. Not all who stood upon Rome's auction blocks were slaves or poor daughters. Some were prisoners of war, paraded naked through the streets before being sold to masters who valued their untouched bodies as trophies. The conquest of a land was mirrored in the conquest of its women, their virginity claimed not by their own people, but by the victors who bought them. For Rome, empire was not only about territory, it was about bodies, absorbed into its vast marketplace, consumed like grain, like wine, like all things that passed through its gates. What did it mean for a young woman to stand there, her innocence the subject of public bidding, her worth shouted out to a crowd of strangers? The auction block reduced her to numbers, her body dissected by the eyes of men, her silence filled by the auctioneer's voice. She may have looked out at the crowd, seeing the raised hands, the nods, the clink of coins changing her future with every gesture. And when the hammer fell, her first night no longer belonged to her, nor to her family. It belonged to the man who had purchased it, the highest bidder in a market that knew no shame. Rome, in its pragmatism, did not veil this practice in sacred language as Babylon had. It called it what it was, commerce. But this bluntness made it no less brutal. Where Babylon sanctified the act with the name of a goddess, Rome stripped away the pretense and laid bare the hunger for ownership, the desire to mark a body with first possession. The city of laws and legions revealed, in its auctions, the stark truth that virginity was never safe from the marketplace. The Senate debated many things: conquest, taxation, the price of grain, but rarely the quiet suffering of those sold upon the blocks. For the powerful, virginity was a tool of policy, a bargaining chip in marriage contracts, a means to strengthen bloodlines. For the poor, it was a last resort, a sacrifice made under the weight of debt or war. For the women themselves, it was silence, their voices drowned beneath the noise of coins and the clamour of the crowd. Yet even in its cruelty, Rome mirrored a truth older than itself, that virginity, fragile and fleeting, has long been bound to value in human societies. It was never simply a threshold of life, but a possession, something guarded, traded, sold, or gestohlen. On Rome's auction blocks, this truth was laid bare for all to see, as clear as the hammer's fall, as undeniable as the coin that changed hands. The empire prided itself on order, on law, on the rule of reason, but in this, as in so many things, it revealed a darker order, an economy of desire where innocence was currency, and the first night could always be bought. The marble arches, the triumphal processions, the statues of emperors, all cast their shadows over this quieter commerce, where virginity stood not as a sacred threshold, but as a commodity shouted to the crowd, a prize for the man with the deepest purse. When the Roman world gave way to kingdoms crowned in stone and silence, the currency of innocence did not vanish. It merely changed its garments. In the courts of medieval Europe, where banners hung heavy in draught-filled halls and candlelight stretched across rough-hewn tables, virginity became less a spectacle of the auction block and more the quiet coin of marriage. What Rome had shouted beneath marble arches, the Middle Ages whispered through parchment contracts, sealed with wax, and witnessed by lords, priests and fathers. The bridal chamber became the new marketplace. Marriage in these centuries was rarely about the joining of hearts. It was an exchange of property, of dowries, of alliances stitched together by necessity. A daughter's virginity stood at the centre of these bargains, not as a tender private truth, but as proof of a transaction fulfilled. For nobles and kings, a wife untouched was the guarantee of a legitimate heir, a bloodline unsullied, a dynasty secured. For peasants and townsfolk, the virgin bride meant honour to the family, a reputation untainted, a commodity that could not be squandered without consequence. The Church, growing in power as Rome's empire crumbled, layered this trade with doctrine. Virginity was exalted as holy, a reflection of the purity of Mary, a mark of sanctity when kept untouched for God. Yet when bound to marriage, the Church required it to be unbroken, a vessel sealed until the wedding night. A virgin bride was not only a social asset, but a spiritual expectation. Her body treated as the unspoiled altar upon which the marital union would be consummated. In sermons and confessional booths, priests spoke of it as treasure, to be guarded, preserved, and delivered intact. This reverence, however, carried with it a weight that pressed heavily on the lives of women. Proof of virginity was demanded with humiliating scrutiny. Families, anxious for reputation, sometimes arranged for the bridal bed to be inspected, the bloodied sheets displayed as evidence of purity's surrender. Among nobles, such displays could affirm alliances between kingdoms, a public token that the contract of marriage had been honoured in flesh. Failure to produce this evidence might unravel a union, spark feuds, or bring accusations that could stain a family's name for generations. Dowries, too, were bound to this expectation. The wealth a bride carried into marriage, chests of coin, parcels of land, bolts of fine cloth, was measured against her untouched state. A virgin bride commanded higher value, her dowry justified by the assurance of legitimacy. A widow, or a woman whispered to have known another man, might see her worth diminished, her family forced to offer greater wealth to balance the scales of her lost innocence. Thus, virginity was not only personal, but economic, influencing the fortunes of entire households. In castles where lords plotted over goblets of wine, and in cottages where peasants stretched their thin harvests, the story was the same. Virginity was transaction. A father guarded his daughter not simply out of love, but out of investment. Suitors negotiated not only with words of affection, but with sums of silver, fields of wheat, or promises of loyalty. The woman at the heart of this trade often had little say, her future decided by men who measured her worth in lineage and land. Yet beneath these rigid structures lay a world of contradiction. The very society that prized virginity for sale, or for marriage, also tolerated its quiet undoing in taverns, in brothels, and in clandestine affairs. In medieval towns, prostitutes were licensed, taxed, and regulated by city councils. Among them, the promise of a virgin commanded the highest fees, just as it had in Rome. Brothel keepers staged performances of purity, swearing that a girl had not yet known a man, while clients paid heavily for what might only be a carefully preserved illusion. The hunger for untouched flesh was never sated. It merely adapted to the shadows and corners of the medieval city. Literature of the age revealed the tension between ideal and reality. Troubadours sang of maidens whose purity was guarded like a fortress, yet the same verses brimmed with hints of seduction, of lovers seeking to breach that very fortress under cover of night. Fabliaux, comic tales whispered in marketplaces and feasting halls, mocked the seriousness with which virginity was guarded, spinning stories of trickery, false sheets, and clever disguises. Behind the solemn contracts and holy sermons lay a society keenly aware of the fragility of its prized currency. Royal courts turned the matter into politics. When Eleanor of Aquitaine was married first to Louis VII of France, and later to Henry II of England, her body carried with it the weight of kingdoms. Whispers about her virginity, her conduct, her fertility, all became weapons wielded by those who sought to question her legitimacy. For queens and noblewomen, the expectation was not simply chastity before marriage, but the appearance of unblemished virtue at all times. A rumour could erode alliances as swiftly as any broken treaty. Among common folk, the transaction was smaller in scale, but no less binding. A village girl's untouched state might mean the difference between marrying into a family of moderate means or being passed over for one of higher standing. Virginity shaped futures, not through public auction, but through the invisible ledger of gossip, honour, and expectation. A single misstep, a pregnancy outside marriage, could condemn her to poverty, shunned by neighbours, her family's reputation dragged through the mud. In this way, virginity was both shield and shackle, protecting some while imprisoning others. The bridal night itself was laden with ritual. In some regions, guests escorted the couple to their bed, offering ribald jokes and songs, their laughter concealing the seriousness of what was expected to follow. The proof of consummation was not merely private, but public, a confirmation that the contract had been sealed. In certain traditions, relatives or attendants waited outside the chamber, ready to bear witness. The sheets, stained with blood, became not a symbol of intimacy, but of property transferred, a receipt written in flesh. Yet not every union ended with such proof. Not every body bled, and not every virgin's innocence was so easily displayed. In these moments, anxiety spread quickly, explanations offered, doubt sown. Remedies ranged from whispered prayers to crude deceptions, animal blood smeared upon the linen, conspiratorial midwives assuring families of what was not true. Such deceptions reveal how fragile and arbitrary the entire system was. A marketplace built on signs and symbols that could be manufactured as easily as they could be genuine. As centuries passed, the rhetoric of the Church deepened the hold of virginity on medieval imagination. Saints were celebrated for preserving their chastity, their untouched state raised above earthly marriage and aligned with heavenly reward. Yet the paradox remained. While spiritual texts praised the woman who remained forever unbroken, society continued to demand that others surrender their virginity at the moment deemed profitable. Whether in a noble marriage or in the purchase made at a brothel, virginity was exalted and exploited, worshipped and sold all at once. The bridal transaction then was never only about two people. It was about families, fortunes, reputations, and entire communities. A girl's body bore the weight of alliances, the pressure of economics, the judgment of faith. Whether in the chamber of a castle or the hut of a peasant, the expectation was unrelenting, that her first night would belong not to her, but to the arrangement struck in her name. The Middle Ages, often imagined as an age of knights and cathedrals, reveals itself differently when seen through this lens. Behind the clang of armour and the chanting of monks lay a quieter economy, one where the most private threshold of a life was treated as public currency. It was not shouted in markets, as in Rome, but it was no less binding. The contracts were written in ink, the evidence demanded in blood, and the worth measured in coin or land. Thus, virginity in the medieval world was neither private possession nor sacred gift. It was transaction, embedded in law, custom, and faith. And though the centuries clothed it in different rituals, the essence remained. The first night of a woman's life was never hers alone. It belonged to the market, to the family, to the expectations of a world that had long ago decided innocence was something to be bought, bargained, and displayed. Trade has always stretched its fingers beyond grain, wool, and salt. In the age when Europe's towns swelled with guilds and markets hummed with the clatter of coin, even chastity became something that merchants, bankers, and shopkeepers could wield as an instrument of power. The same value once bound to dynasties and noble houses seeped into the counting houses and stalls of the rising urban world. Virginity no longer belonged only to kings and priests. It became a merchant's tool, a means to climb, secure, and outmaneuver in the bustling economy of towns. In the growing cities, daughters were as much assets as bolts of silk or barrels of wine. Their chastity was not merely guarded for its spiritual weight or its promise of legitimate heirs, but as a form of credit, a guarantee that could be leveraged in marriage contracts that bound together families of wealth and influence. A father who could present his daughter untouched to a prosperous rival stood to seal alliances more enduring than any handshake in a market square. Chastity was collateral, binding not just two young people, but entire houses into webs of debt and obligation. Guild records whisper of such calculations. A tanner's daughter, pure and unblemished, could secure entry into a merchant family that controlled trade routes to the Baltic. A vintner's child, whose body remained unclaimed, could bring vineyards under the name of a spice dealer. The body became ledger, and chastity its unspent coin. Families invested in its protection as they would guard their storehouses, bolting shutters, watching closely, hiring servants to ensure that no theft occurred. A tarnished reputation was as disastrous as a warehouse fire. Both destroyed capital that could never be replaced. Merchants learned quickly that chastity was a symbol more potent than gold. It could not be forged on the scales, but its reputation carried weight across regions. In Florence, Venice, Bruges, centres of banking and trade, the gossip of a daughter's virtue could influence transactions as surely as the rise or fall of currency. A suitor's trust in the untouched state of his bride was trust in the family's honour, and by extension, in its dealings. The idea that purity could guarantee honesty in trade was not uncommon, a peculiar intertwining of flesh and finance. Yet chastity was not always protected for its own sake. It was deployed. A merchant might delay his daughter's marriage, holding her virginity in reserve until the most favourable contract emerged, as though keeping valuable stock in a locked chest, waiting for the right market. The daughter, waiting in silence, became both pawn and prize, her future measured in the arithmetic of profit margins and shipping ventures. In this way, chastity was less a moral condition than an investment waiting for the proper yield. Literary fragments reveal the unease that crept into these transactions. Tales of cloistered maidens appear again and again. Young women kept behind barred windows, their honour guarded so fiercely that their lives were narrowed to little more than waiting. In some stories, their chastity becomes so exaggerated a commodity that it inspires theft, suitors sneaking like burglars to steal what families so carefully hoarded. These tales were not merely entertainment. They reflected the real anxieties of a culture where chastity was bound as tightly to commerce as it was to morality. The Church, ever vigilant, reinforced this pattern. Priests in market towns reminded merchants that purity in the household ensured divine blessing in business. A chaste daughter reflected a pious father. To offer her intact was to show both spiritual and financial discipline. To fail in this duty was to risk not only scandal, but the suspicion that dishonour might taint every contract signed by that family. A woman's body became a mirror of her father's reliability as a partner in trade. Brothels, too, played their role in this strange economy. Licensed in many towns, they often advertised the supposed presence of virgins, drawing merchants eager to experience what they themselves demanded for their daughters. Here, chastity became counterfeit, a commodity faked and sold, exploiting the same obsession that filled city ledgers with dowry contracts. The contradiction was stark. The very men who sold their daughters untouched state as if it were fine cloth also sought to buy that same illusion in the shadows of the red light quarter. Dowries swelled with this obsession. A daughter whose chastity was beyond doubt could carry less gold into marriage, her untouched state compensating for the lack of coin. Another, whose reputation had been questioned, needed a greater fortune to counterbalance suspicion. Thus, purity was measured not only in moral worth, but in precise economic value. Families bargained over it, as they bargained over rents, interest, and tariffs. To secure a chaste wife was to secure a discount in the ledger of marriage, a saving that could redirect wealth into ships, lands, or warehouses. The merchant class, more than nobility, understood virginity as capital. For nobles, purity was tied to lineage and succession. For merchants, it was tied to liquidity, credit, and expansion. They saw it as negotiable, convertible, and endlessly useful. It was not sanctity they chased, but security. A virgin bride was less likely to invite disputes over inheritance, fewer whispers of illegitimacy, fewer risks to property transfer. Chastity guaranteed clear lines of ownership, and in the world of contracts, clarity was everything. Still, the human cost lingered beneath these transactions. Young women bore the burden of silence, their lives consumed by the expectation that they remain unmarked until called to marriage. A single rumour, a glance too long at a neighbour, an overheard laugh in the wrong company, could devalue them like spoiled goods. Some endured inspections, midwives summoned to confirm what was spoken of in whispers. Others were sent to convents, hidden away until their untouched state could be confirmed by their isolation. The weight of chastity as a merchant's tool pressed upon them as surely as any debt upon their fathers. And yet, not all resisted this trade. Some women, aware of their market value, learned to wield chastity themselves. They delayed suitors, extracting promises and gifts in exchange for what they withheld. They used the expectation of purity as bargaining power, a rare instance in which the commodification of their bodies could tilt toward agency. Their chastity, though demanded by men, could be shaped into leverage, a tool to secure better futures, finer matches, or simply more time. This mercantile approach to innocence reveals the deep entanglement of flesh and finance in medieval and early modern Europe. In counting houses where coins clinked, in guild halls where merchants plotted, in the chambers of families guarding their daughters, chastity was never simply a private state of being. It was an asset, a liability, a commodity, a tool sharpened by fathers, priests and merchants, wielded in contracts that shaped the fates of cities as surely as trade winds shaped the course of ships. Through it all, the story of virginity unfolded, not in passionate embraces or whispered vows, but in ledgers, contracts, and the watchful eyes of neighbours. The marketplace of innocence, once staged in Babylon or Rome, had not vanished. It had merely taken on subtler forms, cloaked in the quiet arithmetic of merchants who knew that the body could be as valuable as any cargo, provided it remained untouched until the bargain was signed. Behind the stone walls of cathedrals and the timbered facades of merchant houses, another marketplace quietly shaped the destiny of women, the economy of dowries. To outsiders it appeared ceremonial, the exchange of wealth to honour a marriage, a tradition wrapped in flowers, feasts, and holy blessing. But beneath the music of bells and the glow of candles, dowries were engines of debt, instruments of leverage, and vaults of expectation. They bound families together, not with affection, but with obligation. Virginity was the spark that gave these contracts their value, and dowries were the mechanism by which that value was calculated and transferred. For centuries, no marriage was complete without this hidden exchange. A daughter did not cross the threshold of her new home without a chest, and that chest was as important as her body. Within it might lie coins, bolts of fine wool, parcels of land, even servants or livestock. It was payment and promise, an offering meant to compensate the groom's family for accepting her. The purity of the bride determined how much needed to be given. If she was untouched, her dowry could be modest, her innocence carrying its own weight. If rumours had clung to her, her dowry had to be heavy, the whispers counterbalanced by gold. Merchants in Florence and Venice kept meticulous records of these exchanges, their ledgers filled with figures that tracked not only trade in silk and spices, but the exact sums attached to marriages. To them, dowries were investments. A daughter married well, with a manageable dowry, could extend a family's influence, opening doors to credit, shipping ventures, and political alliances. A dowry too large could cripple a household, draining resources for a single transaction that might or might not bear fruit. Families calculated these risks carefully, weighing the untouched virtue of their daughters against the coin in their coffers. Debts sprouted from these bargains like weeds. A groom's family might demand more than a bride's household could provide, forcing loans from bankers or pawnbrokers. These loans, taken for the sake of a daughter's future, chained families for decades. Interest gnawed at them, binding their fortunes to a single marriage contract. Entire estates were mortgaged, fields sold, inheritances squandered, all so that a young woman's virginity could be paired with wealth sufficient to satisfy expectation. What appeared to be a joyous union often left behind a trail of creditors, promises, and quiet despair. Noble houses, too, were ensnared in this economy. For them, dowries were not merely economic but political. A king might offer his daughter with ships of silver, not only to secure her marriage, but to cement alliances across borders. A duke might drive his coffers dry to see his daughter wed to a rival's heir, ensuring peace bought with coin. In these transactions, the untouched state of the bride was never assumed lightly. Her virginity was the seal that made the dowry trustworthy, the guarantee that the line would remain unsullied. Without it, even chests overflowing with treasure might not be enough. The church itself, guardian of morality, was deeply entangled in this hidden economy. Convents became both refuge and vault. Families unable to pay dowries might consign their daughters to cloisters, where vows of chastity replaced the cost of marriage. These women became brides of Christ, their virginity preserved but redirected into holy service. Yet even here, economics lurked. Wealthy families endowed convents with gifts to ensure their daughters were accepted, while poorer women often faced rejection or lifelong service without rank. The sacred vow, like marriage, was framed in coin. In towns across Europe, disputes over dowries filled court records. Promised sums went unpaid, leading to lawsuits, feuds, even violence. A husband denied his wife's full dowry might withhold her maintenance, leaving her trapped between two families, both claiming rights to her body and her fortune. Some husbands demanded the return of dowries upon a wife's death. Others clung to them as permanent gains. Widows, stripped of both husband and dowry, often faced destitution, their innocence long spent, their economic worth extinguished. Debt collectors knew these stories well. They stalked the edges of marriages, waiting for payments to lapse, for promises to falter. They cared little for the tears of families or the ceremonies of union. To them, virginity and dowries were not sacred, but collateral. A bride's body, her purity, her dowry, all were pieces in the vast machinery of credit that kept medieval economies turning. The illusion of sanctity veiled what was, in truth, a world of calculated exchanges and relentless obligation. Even literature of the time could not conceal the reality. Comedies staged in marketplaces and plays performed for nobles bound at the absurdity of dowry debts. Fathers bankrupted themselves to marry off daughters. Suitors weighed love against coin, often choosing the latter. Wives were mocked for carrying more gold than beauty, or for entering marriage with a dowry so large their husbands lived in its shadow. Beneath the humour lay unease, an acknowledgement that dowries turned human lives into balance sheets. Women themselves bore the heaviest cost. Their worth was not measured by their laughter, their skills, or their thoughts, but by the size of the chest they carried and the unbroken state of their bodies. A daughter might plead, but her father's debt spoke louder. A wife might dream of love, but her dowry chained her to a man who saw in her only repayment for the wealth she brought. To be untouched was not freedom. It was currency, one that could be spent only once, and only in ways dictated by others. And still, the cycle endured. Families schemed to secure loans, bankers extended credit with interest sharp as knives, convents absorbed the daughters of those who could not pay. Virginity gave dowries their legitimacy, but it was debt that ensured the system's survival. For every marriage celebrated in song and feasting, there were ledgers opened, signatures inked, and repayments scheduled. For every procession of torches and bells, there were creditors waiting in the dark. This hidden economy spread its roots deep. It shaped not only marriages, but entire societies, determining who rose, who fell, who prospered and who was ruined. It tied together merchants and nobles, priests and bankers, fathers and daughters, all caught in the same net of obligation. Dowries, cloaked in ritual and sanctity, were in truth the skeleton key of medieval power. They unlocked doors, they closed them, they weighed on shoulders heavier than any crown. And through it all, virginity remained the silent guarantor. Without it, the dowry lost its edge, the contract its trust, the marriage its foundation. Innocence was not cherished for its purity. It was demanded for its economic function, its ability to uphold debts and justify exchanges. The most private threshold of life became the pivot of entire economies, binding love to coin and coin to power, in ways that still echo in the quiet corners of history. The higher one climbed in the ladders of wealth and privilege, the more fragile the steps beneath their feet became. To live in the shadowed halls of noble houses was to carry both the weight of legacy and the burden of survival. Family names echoed through stone corridors, carved onto banners and painted across coats of arms. But those names were only as strong as the coffers that supported them. Gold could vanish as quickly as honour, and when both slipped away, families who once dined with kings found themselves teetering on the edge of disgrace. In that precarious balancing act, the body of a daughter often became a ledger's solution, her purity another column in the arithmetic of survival. These daughters were never allowed to belong to themselves. From the moment of birth, their worth was calculated not in affection or freedom, but in how effectively they could bind families together. Marriage was less a romance than a treaty, and the maiden was its parchment. The exchange of her virginity was a signature, sealing pacts between rival houses, lifting fortunes and sometimes rescuing dynasties that had sunk deep into debt. It was an inheritance she never asked for, yet one she could not escape. Noble fathers, resplendent in velvet and fur, carried the authority to decide their children's futures. But beneath the polish of grandeur lay desperation. A crumbling estate, an unpaid army, a war lost at the gaming tables. All these stains demanded cleansing, and the surest soap was often the innocence of a young woman. She might be scarcely past childhood, her laughter still bright and unburdened, yet she would be paraded before suitors who evaluated her less for personality than for what her untouched body promised. Legitimacy, heirs without dispute, and alliances sanctified by her unbroken state. The bargaining rarely took place in open markets. Instead, it happened in salons, cloisters, and behind carved wooden doors where men in silks whispered as though moving coins across an unseen board. They spoke of dowries, inheritance rights, and parcels of land as though divvying up maps. Yet beneath these numbers pulsed a truth never said aloud. They were selling a woman's dignity in the guise of family honour. Even the rituals of nobility, balls, feasts, religious ceremonies, were not exempt from this hidden economy. A girl's first public appearance was less a celebration and more an unveiling. She stood in gowns chosen to accentuate youth, her steps rehearsed, her glances trained to be modest yet alluring. Around her, men nodded approvingly or disapprovingly, whispering into goblets about her lineage, the reputation of her mother, and above all, whether her untouched state could be trusted. A single rumour could ruin the investment. If whispers suggested she was less than pure, the negotiations faltered, offers withdrew, and the family's desperation deepened. Virginity was not simply a matter of flesh, but of theatre, supported by the entire household's vigilance. In castles where tapestries muffled the winter cold, maidens lived under careful watch. Servants became jailers in all but name, tasked with ensuring that no uninvited eyes or hands came near. Locks were fitted onto chambers, chaperones assigned even for short walks in gardens. The irony was never lost. The more fiercely the body was guarded, the higher its imagined value. A daughter's virtue became a fortress, and every measure taken to protect it was an investment toward the day it would be relinquished. Some noble women, of course, saw through this theatre. They were not blind to the bargaining. Behind lowered lashes, they watched their fathers calculate, their mothers negotiate, and their brothers boast about alliances their sisters would never fully benefit from. Yet silence was expected, even demanded. To protest was to dishonour the family, and dishonour was a cost no household could afford. Submission was draped in the rhetoric of duty, painted as sacrifice for the greater good. But beneath the surface, it was a transaction as brutal as any market sale. The cruelty deepened when rival houses used virginity as a weapon. A broken engagement, whispered rumours, or accusations of impurity could collapse fortunes and cast shadows over entire dynasties. Enemies spread stories with the precision of merchants undercutting prices, and once doubt took root, it grew like ivy, choking reputations beyond repair. A girl who was accused, even falsely, was not merely disgraced, she was transformed from asset to liability. Families sometimes hurried to conceal such wounds through forced marriages to lesser partners, offering gold as a salve for lost honour. In those arrangements, the girl's autonomy was less than nothing. She was a bargaining chip already damaged, used to settle debts quietly before scandal consumed the name completely. Marriage contracts in these noble circles read like financial charters. Each clause detailed the dowry, the rights to estates, the inheritance of titles, and the guarantees that the bride's virginity was intact. Witnesses signed, priests blessed, and fathers exhaled with relief, as though a debt had been paid. Yet for the bride, the signing was often less triumph than quiet erasure. Her body was now the property of another man, the proof of her worth to be demanded on the wedding night, when blood on the sheets would serve as both evidence and trophy. That blood was not only hers, it was the ink that sealed fortunes and preserved names. There were exceptions, whispers of noble women who manipulated the game for their own survival. Some cleverly fostered reputations of unattainable virtue, extending the negotiations until their family's position strengthened. Others used charm to direct their marriages toward men they found more tolerable, though never free of the underlying exchange. But these were rare, and their stories often drowned beneath the broader tide of women crushed by expectations, sold with all the dignity of coin minted in flesh. The irony was sharpened in courts, where poets and troubadours sang of love, devotion, and the purity of maidens, as though these virtues were heavenly. Behind the curtain, however, those same maidens were bartered in deals that stripped poetry from their lives. The verses were decorations, much like the jewels draped across a young bride's neck, glittering to distract from the chains beneath. Even queens, figures cloaked in majesty, were not exempt. Royal marriages were the grand stage of this commerce, where virginity carried the highest stakes. A queen's body was not her own. It was the vessel of dynasties, the guarantee of heirs without question of legitimacy. Kings demanded it, courts examined it, and ambassadors speculated upon it. A queen without her proof threatened not only her own dignity, but the stability of nations. Some were subjected to humiliating inspections, cloaked in the language of ritual, but steeped in distrust. Their bloodlines were traded like currency, and their bodies became the most valuable banks of all. The sale of dignity was never framed as such. Nobility wrapped it in honour, duty, and legacy. Priests blessed it as divine order. Chroniclers praised it as prudent governance. And fathers justified it as the safeguard of family. Yet the core remained unchanged. The untouched body of a daughter was wealth. The promise of blood unbroken was gold. And her life was weighed not by dreams, but by the preservation of a house's name. When one listens to the echo of these old halls, when one traces the fading crests carved into stone, the stories hidden within them are not only of power and triumph. They are also of daughters who walked silently toward altars, their steps bought and sold long before they understood what was taken from them. To the world, they were jewels set in crowns, but beneath the glitter lay the memory of a marketplace, where dignity itself was placed on the scales, balanced against gold and honour, and too often sold. The boundary between what was sacred and what was profane often blurred in the dimly lit quarters of cities. Behind taverns, along the edges of marketplaces, and tucked into labyrinthine alleys, brothels stood as both scandal and necessity. They were painted in the colours of secrecy, marked by discreet signs or whispered directions, yet known to every man who sought them. These places promised flesh, yet among their most prized offerings was not experience, but innocence. In a paradox that revealed much about human hunger, brothels advertised not the seasoned courtesan, but the untouched girl, her purity crafted into the rarest luxury of all. The business was built upon contradiction. Brothels existed to dissolve boundaries of modesty, to sell what society preached must be preserved. Yet within their walls, the fantasy of virginity became a performance as elaborate as any staged play. Men with purses heavy from trade or conquest came not simply for pleasure, but for the illusion that they were the first, that in that fleeting encounter they touched something unspoiled. It mattered little that such purity was often an invention. What mattered was that it could be purchased. Cities from the Mediterranean to the heart of Europe developed reputations for these establishments. Venice, with its winding canals and masked nights, became infamous for brothels that promised maidens hidden beneath silken veils. In Paris, districts grew where whispers told of girls fresh from the convent, though few had ever seen cloisters. Even in London, where morality was draped in sermons, rumours spread of houses that could provide a virgin for the right price. Everywhere, the trade wore the same disguise. The promise that chastity could be bought like wine, poured and consumed before it spoiled. The allure was not only sensual, but social. To claim one had taken the virginity of a maiden, even one bought in the shadows, was to boast of conquest. Among nobles, merchants, and soldiers, such tales swelled reputations. It was not simply flesh purchased, but a story, a badge of superiority, proof that wealth could command even the most guarded treasure. For some, it was less about desire than about dominance, the act itself reduced to a display of ownership. The brothels understood this hunger, and learned to craft illusions with ruthless precision. Girls too young or too vulnerable to resist were hidden away until the right buyer appeared. In some cases, they were not virgins at all, but clever tricks were employed to simulate the proof. Herbs and poultices were used to tighten, staged resistance was performed, and in some cases, even animal blood was prepared to stain sheets, convincing men that they had indeed broken what was unbroken. The deception mattered little. Clients left satisfied, convinced they had paid for purity, while the brothel counted the coins and prepared the next performance. Behind these transactions lay grim realities. Families in debt sometimes sold their daughters directly to these houses, cloaking desperation in silence. Others were kidnapped, promised work as servants, and delivered instead to locked chambers. For the brothels, girls were commodities, their lives measured by how convincingly they could act the role of innocence. Once the performance was used up, once blood was spilled or the illusion broken, they joined the ranks of the ordinary prostitutes. their value diminished, their lives spent in dim corners where no promises of purity remained. The price for this first night was staggering compared to the earnings of common women of the trade. A virgin could fetch sums that rivaled a dowry, coins enough to feed a household for months, even years. It was not unusual for wealthy men to pay what might have secured farmland or ships for the chance to claim what was said to be untouched. In this way, the brothel mirrored the noble houses, only stripped of pretense. Where fathers cloaked transactions in honour, brothels offered the same exchange openly, reducing it to its brutal arithmetic. The Church, in its proclamations, thundered against these practices, calling them abominations and sins against both God and the natural order. Yet even within holy cities, whispers persisted of brothels that promised virgins to the very men who knelt in pews on Sunday. Preachers railed at pulpits, but silence fell when powerful patrons were named. The contradiction became another rhythm of medieval and early modern life. Morality proclaimed in daylight, transactions conducted by candlelight. One of the most disturbing aspects was how the brothel co-opted the language of sanctity. The word pure was used not in reference to faith or spirit, but to flesh, rebranded as merchandise. Virginity, once bound to concepts of honour, became just another tier in a price list. The sacred had been inverted into commerce, and in that inversion lay a truth about human desire. Purity itself was consumable, like bread, wine, or silk, valued not for what it was, but for the power it granted to those who claimed it. Travellers wrote of these houses with both fascination and disgust. Chroniclers described chambers draped in silks, where trembling girls were presented as though on altars, their fear mistaken for modesty. Some men even sought the most terrified, believing genuine fright proved authenticity. It was a cruelty woven seamlessly into pleasure, each moment of trembling treated as confirmation that the purchase was real. The market thrived on that mixture of innocence and suffering, and men returned again and again, even when they knew deception was likely. Yet these brothels did not exist in isolation. They were fed by the same structures that governed noble marriages and dowries. Where aristocrats sold daughters for alliances, the brothel sold them for currency alone. Where castles guarded purity to auction it at the altar, brothels staged purity to sell it by the bed. Both were theatres, different in costume but identical in purpose, to make virginity a coin, a negotiable value to be traded. The trade even extended into the exotic. Foreign girls were prized, their strangeness adding to the illusion of rarity. Travellers returning from wars brought tales of virgins from distant lands, captured and delivered into city brothels. Their bodies were woven into fantasies of conquest, proof not only of a man's wealth, but of his reach. It was not only a body purchased, but a piece of the world claimed, reduced to skin and silence. For the women trapped in these systems, the promises of purity were both cage and weapon. Some were forced to smile through the charade, taught to feign innocence until the moment was sold. Others, broken by fear, accepted silence as survival. The blood that marked their first sale often carried with it the death of freedom, binding them to lives they never chose. In dark rooms where laughter of clients echoed, their dignity was drained one coin at a time. What is most haunting is how ordinary it became. The men who paid were not always villains in their own minds. They were merchants, soldiers, lords, and even clerics, carrying on what they believed was privilege or custom. The women who provided the illusion were not seen as people, but as instruments in a ritual of possession. The brothel, with its candles, perfumes, and silks, was a stage where dignity and humanity were discarded, leaving only the transaction. And so the cycle turned, century after century, in cities where wealth gathered and desires burned unchecked. Brothels that promised purity became emblems of the darkest paradox, that what was most sacred could also be most easily sold. In their shadows, humanity revealed its hungers not for love or connection, but for conquest disguised as intimacy, for illusions dressed as truths. When one imagines these chambers now, long emptied, their walls crumbling back into dust, the silence lingers heavier than the echoes of laughter. The illusion of purity has vanished, but the memory of the bargain remains, etched in histories that preferred to whisper rather than shout. These were not houses of pleasure, but markets of dignity, where purity was promised, purchased, and discarded, one coin at a time. History often records the price of a thing, but rarely lingers on the silence that follows its sale. The contracts, the coins, the transactions, all of these are carefully documented, but the lives that slipped into darkness after those exchanges were seldom written down. Behind every ledger entry, behind every whispered bargain struck in halls, streets, or brothels, there were the quiet footsteps of those sold. Their voices, when raised, were ignored, and when broken, they fell unheard. What remains to us now is not their testimony, but the faint outlines of their absence, the silence that clings to the spaces where their stories should have been. For the women and girls whose virginity was treated as merchandise, suffering became a private chamber, locked away from the world. They were paraded when innocence was to be displayed, groomed and dressed to fit the fantasy of purity. Yet once the transaction was complete, they were ushered into shadows where their worth diminished with every passing day. A girl who had been sold as a virgin was no longer a treasure to be guarded, but an object that had fulfilled its single, terrible purpose. What remained of her life unfolded in obscurity, too mundane and too shameful for chroniclers to deem worthy of ink. Some lived within brothels after their first sale, their existence reduced to routine. Their bodies became familiar rather than novel, their names forgotten by the men who once paid dearly to claim them. The fear that once gave their performance authenticity dulled into resignation. They sat in corners when not summoned, their eyes fixed on walls darkened by soot and smoke, waiting for footsteps that brought neither affection nor respect. Silence grew around them, because their suffering was unremarkable. Once the illusion of virginity was gone, so too was the interest in their fate. Others were married off after their value had been used, presented to men who either did not know or did not care what history clung to them. These marriages often became another form of imprisonment, where obedience was demanded, but dignity was never restored. In such homes, silence was enforced by duty. A wife's suffering was to remain unspoken, her role not to tell, but to endure, and endure they did, hidden beneath the rhythms of household labour, the bearing of children, and the endless cycle of work that erased the memory of what had been stolen. What threads connect these lives across centuries is not only silence, but also shame. Society ensured that those who were sold bore the burden of disgrace, even though they had no voice in the matter. They were branded not as victims, but as stained, their worth reduced not by what was done to them, but by the fact that it had been done at all. To speak of their suffering would have been to invite ridicule or punishment, and so they carried it inward, burying their grief where no one could reach. Shame became a second cage, as confining as the first. There were, too, those whose suffering ended swiftly and brutally. Sold into the marketplace of virginity, they never lived long enough to grow into the women they might have been. Illness, violence, and despair claimed them quickly. Their names dissolved into the earth, their bodies unmarked by grave or stone. The silence around them is heavier still, because it was not even recognized as loss. In the ledgers of history, Their existence is not recorded as lives, only as prices once paid. And yet, for all this silence, the echoes remain. The writings of men who purchased them contain faint glimpses of the girl's terror, an observation of trembling hands, a note about tears mistaken for modesty, a remark about resistance that was read as charm. These fragments, unintended confessions, allow us to hear faintly what those girls could not speak. Between the lines of bragging and boasting, the quiet cry of suffering seeps through. It is not their voice, but it is proof that their suffering existed even when it was ignored. In the corridors of power, noble daughters endured their own version of this silence. They were sold through dowries and arranged marriages, their purity auctioned for alliance rather than coin. Yet once the vows were spoken, they too were left to bear their pain quietly. A noble woman who resented her marriage or mourned her lost freedom had little recourse but silence. Her face was expected to remain calm, her words measured, her obedience complete. She was celebrated as a vessel of honour, but lived as a prisoner of expectation. In ballads and records, she appeared as a bride or mother, but the loneliness that followed her was never written. This silence was not accidental, it was enforced. Culture, law, and religion each played their part in keeping the voices of the souled muted. Laws punished women who spoke of dishonour, even when that dishonour had been forced upon them. Religion demanded modesty, patience, and acceptance, condemning those who complained as sinful. Families turned away, unwilling to see in their daughters a reflection of their own desperation or greed. In every direction, the paths of expression were blocked, leaving only inward suffering, the weight of grief carried in silence. There is a particular cruelty in how society used silence as a shield. As long as the women did not speak, men could pretend their actions bore no consequence. The marketplace could continue without guilt, because the cries of the souled were never heard in courts, churches, or markets. The silence became complicity, protecting those who profited and punishing those who endured. To be sold was one wound. To be denied a voice was another, deeper one, ensuring that history itself would struggle to find them. Even so, not all forms of silence were the same. Some women crafted silence into a weapon, withdrawing into themselves in ways that denied their captors satisfaction. They refused to flatter or entertain, meeting cruelty with stillness, making their silence an act of defiance rather than submission. Others told their stories in whispers to each other, behind closed doors, weaving secret sisterhoods of shared pain. These voices rarely reached beyond the walls that confined them, but they carried strength nonetheless. They kept alive the memory that they had been wronged, even when the world insisted otherwise. When we read history through its silences, we see not absence, but presence. Each missing voice testifies to the suffering that was deliberately erased. The quiet around the souled is not empty. It is full of grief, of fear, of lives lived under the weight of choices they never made. Their silence, though unintended, has become a monument, a haunting reminder of what happens when humanity turns purity into property and dignity into a commodity. The marketplace for virginity thrived on illusions of purity, but it survived on silence. Without the quiet compliance of its victims, without the muting of their pain, the trade could not have endured. Their suffering was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was the foundation upon which the entire system rested. Every coin that passed hands carried not only the illusion of innocence, but also the burden of voiceless sorrow. And so the story lingers not in the records of kings or merchants, but in the shadows they left behind. The women and girls sold into this marketplace did not have the power to shape the histories written in ink, but their silence has shaped the history we inherit nonetheless. We may not know their names, but we feel their absence. We may not hear their words, but we sense their pain. The silence they were forced to bear now demands that we listen, not to what is written, but to what is missing. A deal, written in ink, has more power than any sword. Words on parchment, signed with trembling hands, could reshape the life of a young woman before she had even spoken her first vows in church or whispered her first secrets to a friend. It is in these contracts that the sale of virginity found its most polished, most unyielding form. A transaction clothed not in whispered promises behind closed doors, but in public acknowledgement, legally binding and entirely merciless. These contracts did not emerge in a vacuum. They grew in a world that worshipped ownership and security above all else. Property passed from father to son, debts lingered across generations, and merchants craved guarantees as steady as the sea's tides. Virginity, fragile and fleeting as it was, became something that could be pinned down with pen strokes and coin. A father could sit at a table with a potential husband or creditor, unroll a sheet of parchment, and seal the fate of his daughter's body and dignity with a few neat signatures. The language of these documents was often dressed in formality, but the reality beneath the words was stark. A pledge of honour, or assurance of virtue, might appear in neat Latin script, but its meaning was blunt. The girl was to be untouched, her worth measured against her chastity. Should this promise fail, if whispers of scandal appeared, or worse, if proof surfaced, then penalties were severe. Dowries would be seized, property lost, families disgraced. A woman's body thus became collateral, a piece of flesh transformed into currency, traded between men who sought to balance accounts. It is difficult to say what felt more crushing, the coin that changed hands, or the ink that removed all possibility of escape. For the young women involved, the contract was both invisible and inescapable. They rarely saw the documents themselves. Instead, they heard their names spoken in negotiations they could not interrupt, promises about their futures exchanged in rooms where they were not permitted to sit. They lived under the shadow of agreements that bound them tighter than chains, though no iron touched their skin. The merchants, nobles, and bankers who crafted these contracts did so with the cool precision of men handling grain shipments or shipments of silk. Each clause carried weight. Some even went so far as to outline financial penalties for consummation discovered prior to marriage, as though one could tally shame in silver coins. Others were subtler, weaving conditions into dowry exchanges. Should the bride prove not to be a virgin, the groom might return her to her family, keeping both the dowry and his pride intact. The humiliation was not only personal, it was legal, official, and devastating. In many ways, these contracts transformed virginity into a financial instrument. It was no longer just a fragile idea, a symbolic threshold. It became a commodity with a price tag, tracked with the same seriousness as a vineyard or a fleet of ships. A girl's purity could pay off a father's debts, secure a partnership between rival houses, or provide leverage in a dispute over land. Entire fortunes rose and fell on the backs of these private bargains. What made it all the more cruel was that the central figure, the girl herself, was given no voice in the exchange. She was the subject of the contract, never its author. There were, of course, those who profited handsomely. Wealthy families with daughters of marriageable age found themselves courted by merchants eager for alliances. A maiden's virginity was not just her own secret, it was an asset her parents could leverage. In Venice, Florence, and countless cities where trade reigned supreme, these contracts were as common as shipping manifests. They blurred the line between household management and human trade. One could imagine a merchant poring over his accounts at night, weighing his investments, his ships, his warehouses, and among them the fate of his daughter's body, written in figures that only he could read. But what of the women? For them, the contract stripped away the last remnants of choice. To resist was to break not only with family, but with the law. A refusal could ruin reputations and scatter fortunes. Even whispers of disobedience could bring shame upon an entire household. Many learned silence early, a silence that became its own survival. Their lives were not their own. They were lived on borrowed terms, dictated by men who spoke in the language of property and security. And yet, within these carefully crafted agreements, there were contradictions. Contracts could demand purity, but they could not prevent reality from intruding. Secret affairs, forced encounters, or even the violence of men who thought themselves untouchable, all of these could break the illusion upon which fortunes rested. When this happened, the contracts revealed their sharpest edges. Blame fell not on the men, but upon the woman, who was accused of betrayal, dishonour, or worse. The clauses of ink turned against her, stripping away not only her protection, but her very personhood. It was this precariousness that gave such force to the marketplace of virginity. Behind the polished signatures and wax seals lay an unspoken truth. A woman's body could be priced, but it could never be entirely controlled. Still, the attempt to control it persisted, century after century, carried forward by a belief that ink and coin could enforce virtue where choice was denied. Consider the courtroom scenes where such contracts were disputed. Families dragged their daughters before officials, demanding judgments about their chastity. Physicians were summoned to testify, examining young women in a humiliating display meant to determine whether the promises of the contract had been upheld. These trials were brutal, not only in their invasiveness, but in their cold precision. A young woman's future might be decided by the testimony of strangers, while her own voice was disregarded entirely. It is here, in these rooms of law and ink, that the human cost of the system becomes clearest. A contract could protect wealth, but it could also crush spirit. It ensured stability for the merchant, but it ensured silence for the maiden. And in a world where silence was equated with obedience, the system thrived. The voices of the women who suffered under these agreements rarely reached parchment themselves. They survive only in fragments, whispers in letters, hints in diaries, mentions in court records. Their stories were written not in the contracts that bound them, but in the quiet despair that followed. And so, the cycle continued. A girl was promised, her body accounted for in figures and clauses. A father gained security, a husband gained assurance, and the ledger balanced neatly. But beneath the surface, the ink carried weight heavier than coin. It carried the burden of lives diminished, voices erased, and choices stolen. In the end, contracts did what society demanded of them. They maintained order. They kept wealth where it was meant to stay, cemented alliances, and upheld the illusion of purity as a tradable good. Yet in doing so, they transformed the most intimate part of a human life into nothing more than a clause in a bargain. This was the loss of choice, buried beneath coins and signatures. A silence that stretched across centuries, broken only when history itself chose to remember. The candles of the past do not burn out easily. Their smoke lingers in the air, even after the flame has died. What began as contracts, as coins, as whispers of purity traded like property, did not vanish when the parchments crumbled or the noble houses fell. Instead, the logic of the marketplace clung to society, reshaping itself, wearing new masks, but always reaching for the same bargain. The human body sold, the idea of chastity turned into currency. Even as kingdoms fell and new nations rose, the obsession with virginity remained stubbornly intact. Its price might have shifted, its forms might have changed, but its weight pressed on generation after generation. For those who lived through it, the darkness was not confined to a medieval ledger or a Renaissance courtroom. It seeped into the quiet corners of family life, into the hushed instructions of mothers to their daughters, into the calculating plans of fathers seeking advantage. It became less about parchment and more about expectation, but the effect was the same. The language grew subtler. Where once clauses demanded purity and ink, now reputations were defended with gossip and silence. A daughter's worth still hovered on the edge of what could be proven or disproven. Whispers of impropriety could sink a family just as surely as a broken contract had once bankrupted a merchant. Entire households lived beneath an invisible economy where a young woman's choices, or lack thereof, could tip the balance of fortune. The currency was no longer only coin, it was also respectability, honour, and standing in a community that measured virtue in silence and compliance. For the women themselves, little truly changed. They were still raised with the knowledge that their first experience of intimacy was not entirely their own. It belonged to the family, to the reputation of the household, and to the unseen market that judged and watched. Though the brothels of the past that promised purity might have been shuttered, though the contracts of dowries grew less rigid in law, the cultural bargain endured. Virginity was never simply personal. It was a social token, passed along, whispered about, judged and weighed. In certain corners of the world, the marketplace retained its literal form. Families still negotiated marriages where purity was assumed and tested, where dowries shifted hands, where bodies were bound up in debts unpaid. The modern era brought no immunity. The dresses changed, the languages changed, the rituals changed, but the trade itself was older than memory, and it adapted to every age with ruthless ease. Even in the so-called enlightened centuries, when revolutions promised liberty and equality, the burden remained curiously unchanged. Men could speak of freedom, yet still measure a woman's value by her chastity. Legal contracts might lose their sharp edges, but cultural contracts remained. A broken reputation could still mean ruin. A rumour could undo years of careful planning, leaving women once more as collateral in the invisible transactions of pride and power. The persistence of this darkness is perhaps its most chilling feature. History often promises progress, but in this matter, progress was halting, fragile, and uneven. In one city, women might gain the right to speak in court, to inherit property, to walk without a chaperone. Yet in another, barely a mile away, their bodies were still tallied like livestock, their futures traded for alliances. What was sold as liberation in public discourse often stopped at the threshold of the household, where old bargains held firm. And so the centuries passed, each generation layering its own language onto the same unchanging system. In medieval times, it was parchment and dowry. In early modern Europe, it was whispers and courtrooms. In the industrial age, it was reputation and respectability, guarded as fiercely as gold. And today, though the contracts have faded, the remnants of that marketplace still reach us. The obsession with purity, the surveillance of women's choices, the moral weight placed upon their private lives, all echo from those long ago rooms where fathers traded ink for coin. The cruelest part of this continuity is that it is rarely acknowledged. The system hides itself in rituals of love, in the trappings of tradition, in the language of honour. Few admit that what they protect is not virtue, but control. Fewer still recognise that the darkness they inherit is older than their family names, older than their churches, older than the very cities they live in. The marketplace was never dismantled. It was only disguised, folded into the fabric of culture so thoroughly that many mistake it for nature itself. For those who lived under its weight, there was no neat ending. The girl sold through contract became the mother who warned her daughter to obey. The daughter, in turn, passed the same silence along, not because she believed in its justice, but because she knew the cost of defiance. In this way, the trade survived without needing parchment or coin. It survived through fear, through habit, through the quiet endurance of those who carried its burden. There is a temptation, when tracing this history, to believe it is locked safely in the past, a strange relic of merchants and nobles long gone. But the echoes are too loud, the continuities too sharp. The commodification of purity may no longer involve signed contracts in candlelit halls, yet its spirit is alive in every judgment passed on women for choices that men make freely. It lingers in the way families still guard reputation, in the way entire communities attach worth to innocence as if it could be bought or sold. The truth is simple, though rarely spoken. The darkness never ended. It slipped quietly from one form into another, surviving revolutions, reforms, and declarations of equality. Like the smoke of those extinguished candles, it drifts invisibly, choking without being seen. And though the names of those ancient contracts may have faded, their logic remains, etched not on parchment, but in culture itself. The history of virginity for sale is not a tale with a closing chapter. It is a thread woven through centuries, binding together merchants, nobles, fathers, daughters, and strangers who never met, but who all played roles in the same cruel play. Its endurance is not proof of its truth, only of its usefulness to those who held power. And until its logic is fully broken, its shadow stretches forward, a darkness that never truly ended, lingering even now, just beneath the surface of what we call progress. And so, our story drifts to its quiet end. Tonight, we wandered through a marketplace unlike any other, a place where innocence itself became a form of currency. We traced the shadows of fathers counting coins, of contracts inked in candlelight, of temples and courts cloaking trade in the language of holiness. We followed how that trade endured across centuries, shifting from dowries to whispers, from parchment to reputation. And we saw the quiet weight it left upon the daughters, carrying a burden that was never truly theirs to bear. The question, of course, is what stayed with you most? Was it the image of the girl, silent in the corner of the room while her future was negotiated? Was it the thought of coins stacked neatly on a table, exchanged not for land or cattle, but for something far more fragile? Or was it the realization that this marketplace never truly ended, that even now its echoes linger quietly in culture, hidden behind words like honor, purity, and respectability? These are the quiet truths that history often tucks away. Not the banners of victory, not the rise of kings, but the small and unyielding rituals that shape daily life for countless generations. To see them is unsettling, but to see them is also to understand the long shadows we still live with. If this journey gave you something to think about, or simply carried you a little closer to rest, I'd love to hear your reflections. Share in the comments. What part of tonight's story struck you most? And let's see the map of listening lights across the world once again. And if you'd like to walk further into these forgotten corners of the past, consider subscribing to the channel. That way, when the night is quiet again, and you're ready for another story, you'll know where to return. For now, let the candles burn low. Let the noise of the day fade, and may sleep find you gently. Until next time, good night.